Early in the season, we attempted a short spring cruise in company with Santana. We eventually retreated into Weymouth after setting off across the Channel, but encountering poor visibility and a worsening forecast. Another Marchwood boat, Dreamer, arrived as well. We were clearly going to be stuck for a few days, and I applied my rule of thumb that in such circumstances the best thing to do is to get in touch with the Dutch boats in the harbour, because they're always more fun. There were two. Skewer was a Tradewinds 39, stretched to about 42 feet. Arthur and Hecky were headed towards Ireland or Scotland. Kind of Magic was a 42-foot composite boat that Hank had completed over a period of 18 months, a magnificent achievement. Hank and Yorker were off to Spain and would later sail in company with Dreamer for a while. Altogether, we were in Weymouth for 5 days, and that meant 5 parties. Looking at this picture, one can see Jim, Mia, Dan, David Cahoon, David Quantrell, those two were crewing on Santana. Then there's Yorker and Hank, and then Arthur and Hecky nearest to the camera. I was behind the camera, so somebody else took this one a bit later. On some days, we went out to see the local countryside, including a trip to Portland on a very stormy day. Eventually, we watched Dreamer and A Kind of Magic head off towards Spain, and at about the same time, Skewer headed west as well. Santana and ourselves waited till the following morning, and then had a wild sail inside St Albans Race.
No. That's got nothing to do with that.
We chose to use the North Channel into the Solent. About a week after we all got back in September, Henk appeared sailing single-handed. Yorker had already gone back to Holland. He was a welcome visitor to Marchwood Yacht Club and was entertained during his stay by Jim and Mia. A couple of weeks later, we had a phone call from Arthur. Skewer had got as far as Dingle, where Arthur had found his accordion in great demand in the folk pubs. It was mid-afternoon when we got away on our main summer cruise. After a false start due to a thundersquall, we left Studland in the evening, which meant 2 nights at sea. The wind was a moderate northwesterly which faded during the night. During the day, we saw quite a number of ships as we angled across the main shipping lane, and several altered course for us. On a second morning, the wind freshened such that we lowered the main and ran into Labavrak under Genoa only. Conditions remained favourable, so we pressed on the next day through the Canal de Four. The passage ended with a sparkling sail, with good views of Point St Matthew and the Tadepa Rocks. We were still anxious to press on to the south, where it would be warmer and sunnier, so after a short stop in Camaret to restock, we made a long hop from Camaret through the Raz de Seine and continued past the point of Penmarsh to Loch Tudi. On arrival there, our warps were taken by the crew from Mojito, David and Val, and by some friends from Marchwood, Ken and Liz Sizer, who were cruising in their Victoria 34. We had taken advantage of the favourable winds and made fast time across the channel and through the two most difficult passages of the journey. We were now well into our cruising area, but the weather was set to deteriorate for a few days, so we decided to move on the next day to Bellon, where we could wait in an attractive river rather than sit in a marina. It is only a short run to Bellon, and we needed a certain amount of rise of tide by the time we reached there. Accordingly, we delayed our departure until 14:45 and then set off on a dead run with the wind only forced to northwest with full main and the jib pulled out. By 18:30 we were entering Bellon with just 0.4 metres under the keel, guided by some helpful fishermen who showed us where the deep water was, and by 1900 we were secured on the buoy. 2 hours later, Mojito arrived and rafted up alongside. Altogether, we spent 3 nights in Bellon, enjoying a good seafood lunch at the creperie and some lovely walks along the banks of the river. There were some stunning views. It blew quite hard while we were in Bellon, but after 3 nights we were ready to move on. It is not a long passage to Lorient, and the winds were light, so we just drifted past the coast in company with Mojito, which was headed for Ile de Grace. Then we jibed and headed gently back up into the harbour area, passing the fort at Port Louis to starboard and the massive submarine pens to port. We went up into the town marina because I was keen to see if I could find a solution to the computer problem with the machine that received weather facts. In the event, it turned out to be not possible, but I did manage to find the shop that sold the most magnificent pizza you have ever had in your life. Although I had failed to solve the weather facts problem, I was not too concerned. Not only are the French Coast Guard forecasts superior to those in the UK and even in Ireland, but there is a newspaper called West France that publishes each day a half-page of weather information that is completely adequate, giving weather charts, satellite pictures, regional forecasts, shipping forecasts. As a last resort, I could always go onto the internet using GPRS and get weather maps from the UK Met Office via the BBC. Although the weather had got warmer once we came round to South Brittany, it was not yet hot. There was still a tendency for disturbed weather in the English Channel, only 50 miles to the north, and it was clear that it was a lot warmer further south. Moreover, we did not know how long the current pattern of northwesterly winds would continue. We therefore decided to push on, even though there was little wind, and it meant motoring all the way to Sauzon in Belle-Île, passing the Birividic lighthouse that stands isolated in the middle of the sea. Unfortunately, the tide times were not really suitable for going up the harbour and drying out on legs, so we secured fore and aft to the buoys near the harbour entrance. At last we seemed to have found the heat, and we spent a lazy evening just watching the harbour activity. That night there was a mild vent solaire, the reverse of the sea breeze that strikes at about midnight and goes on almost until dawn, sometimes reaching force 6 from the northeast. The boat was moving quite a lot, but Dan managed to sleep through it all. It was now very hot in Sauzon. It also looked as though it was beginning to get crowded, and there would be a further risk of a vent solaire the following night, so even Le Palais would not be an alternative. Also, we had a commitment to link up with Claudine, who was part owner of a rustler and who lives in Pornic. We decided to try and reach La Baule, even though this would require quite a bit of motoring unless the afternoon sea breeze filled in. It was nearly 10 o'clock by the time we set off, motoring to the south of Huat and Herdic. The sea breeze did not arrive, so rather than motor all the way to La Baule, we diverted to La Tourballe. We had managed to sail for short periods, but the wind was not reliable. By the time we reached La Tourballe at 17:10, we had covered 30 miles. Although the facilities for yachts at La Tourballe had been improved, and it has a reputation for having very good fresh fish, it is not a particularly attractive place to be in hot weather, which we were now experiencing. But by the next morning there was still very little sign of any wind. Accordingly, we decided that we would just motor round the corner to La Baule, a town and a marina that we had never visited before. At 11:20 we set off under engine, passing the entrance to Le Croisic, then negotiating a short cut close to the headland that we had spotted on the sea map chart. It is a long transit, but not too difficult once the leading marks have been identified. We were able to sail along the coast before working our way behind the rocks that protect the bay off La Baule. To our surprise, a brisk sea breeze then filled in, and we realised that we still had enough run of tide to be able to get all the way to Pornic. We quickly bore away and raced through the central passage into the bay, then charged across the Loire estuary before turning into the marina at Pornic and making fast to the visitors' pontoon. What had threatened to be another day of heat and no wind had produced some sparkling sailing. Claudine needed a couple of days to clear up a few things before she was able to join us, so we had a lazy day, which turned out to be rather windy, waiting in the marina. She ran us up to the supermarket, and then entertained us to a splendid supper at home in the evening. The next day was much more settled, so rather than wait in the marina, we drifted across to one of our favourite anchorages at Bois de la Chaise off the island of Noirmoutier. Anchorages are a rare commodity once one gets this far south in France. It was the beginning of the heatwave that was to last a full month. Heatwaves have the rather strange French name of la canicule, a word that completely floored us the first time we saw it in a newspaper headline. The cockpit table was set up and we enjoyed a lunch of crevette and muscadet and whiled away the time as it got hotter and hotter. This led to a decision that at the earliest opportunity we would purchase a fan. Our supernumerary crew, comprising Monkey and Puffin, absolutely insisted on enjoying the sunshine with us. Den seemed to like the heat, but Monkey, Puffin and I adjourned below to escape the scorching sun. The next day we ambled gently back to Pornic, where Claudine joined us in the evening to enable us to make an early start. We were away at 08:15, motor sailing with a northerly force 2 wind. The engine stayed on as we motored past Les Baudières and round the top of Noirmoutier and down the shallow channel between Noirmoutier and Ile Pilier, known as the Canal de la Grise. At noon we were able to deploy a cruising chute which we carried all the way to Ile Dieu, and by 3 o'clock we were alongside in Port Joinville. The next day started gently enough with visits to the boulangerie and the poissonnerie, followed by a leisurely lunch ashore. We were all feeling rather lazy in the heat, so we opted for a gentle trip on the public bus across the island La Merle, a tiny little harbour on the Atlantic coast. By this stage in the proceedings, Den had started to learn some of the secrets of French cuisine from Claudine, lessons that were to stand us in good stead for the rest of the cruise. The West France forecast would remain substantially unchanged for many weeks. It must have become tedious being a forecaster. High pressure over Biscay, with very few isobars in the area, led to cloudless skies and very light winds, with some days producing a sea breeze in the afternoons. The VHF forecast used phrases like vent de nord-ouest, 2 à 3 Beaufort, mer belle à peu agitée. Even so, the headline writers managed a few gems. It was now July, and all French marina prices double. The day dawned hot and sunny, so we motored gently down the coast, with Claudine carrying out a pilotage exercise which I think helped boost her confidence. We anchored in La Vieille for lunch. Claudine wanted to do some more pilotage, so we left at 1300 with the plot switched off, heading for Saint-Gilles-Croix-de-Vie, which was not visible in the heat haze, even though it was only 10 miles away. Once clear of the island, we were able to turn off the engine and sailed gently along. By 14:30, the cursing chute was deployed for a couple of hours. We arrived at Saint-Gilles at low tide, and the channel was shallower than predicted on the charts, so there were a few anxious moments as we motored in. By 1700, we were alongside in the marina. After Claudine had been picked up by one of her neighbours to return home, Den and I had a very pleasant seafood meal in the local bistro. The following morning I was able to purchase a fan at the local chandlery, and it was a great relief in the cabin to get it mounted and working. Already daytime temperatures were about 35 centigrade, and at night it rarely went below 29 centigrade. Since going through the Raz de Seine, we had hardly had to consider the effect of tides, but in the Pertuis Breton, behind the Ile de Ré, tides become important again. We wanted to avoid a stop in Sable d'Olonne, but could not quite reach St. Martin, so we opted for a short sail down the coast to the artificial marina and resort of Bourgogne. Once there was a gentle breeze, which gave a beat along the coast, and we had an interesting day trying to work out where the next shift would come from. On the whole, we were fairly successful in guessing when the sea breeze would arrive, and we were well placed to seaward to take advantage of the major shift that ensued. The most amazing incident was when we were some 4 miles off the coast and found a small plastic dinghy that cannot have been more than 8 feet long, in which there were 4 fishermen. There was certainly no spare engine, and no evidence of life jackets either. The French must have charmed lives. It was mid-afternoon when we crept into Bourgogne near the bottom of the tide and found a berth. We were soon visited by Jeff Owen of Ariane, who was on a cruise with his family. As usual, we were entertained by his acerbic wit. We waited till mid-morning to let the thunderstorms clear before we set off. At first, the wind was westerly forced 5 and very gusty, but it was still sunny. It turned out to be a fast sail all the way to the Ray Bridge. We had been in touch with Terry and Ruby on Danaï by text and called them as we passed under the bridge on the VHF. They were in the Menil Marina at La Rochelle, which they informed us was very full. They advised us to motor as hard as we could while they tried to reserve a berth and ignore the usual reception arrangements. This we did with great success. Motoring up to the marina, we could see the twin towers of the old harbour, an image that had inspired my cruising ambition from the days of my youth. Our southbound journey was now complete, and we could settle into a few days' rest and some gentle sailing in company with Danaï. We were now in Charente-Maritime, the large yachting area that includes both La Rochelle and the Ile de Ré. We stayed in the marina at Les Minimes for 4 days. The scarcity of berths was such that it was not possible to think about popping out for an afternoon sail and coming back. We had pushed fairly hard to get here, while Terry and Ruby were still in the area in Danaï, and we were glad of the break. Immediately opposite our pontoon was the Ingling fleet. There were about 60 of them involved in their World Championships. It was fascinating to watch this fleet prepare each morning and return in late afternoon, with people diving over the side to polish the bottom of the boat. Mojito was in the Old Town Marina. We had been there on previous visits, and it is great fun, but a little bit noisy. As there is a regular river bus from Les Minimes to the town, it is in many ways preferable to be in Les Minimes. Even so, it was fun to go up to the town again and stroll around the market and other areas. On one day, we had lunch at a restaurant with David and Val from Mojito. Dan's starter was almost the size of a seafood platter. Although the marina seemed completely incapable of managing the berthing arrangements, it was otherwise an excellent facility. One great improvement was the introduction of a Wi-Fi service at the cost of €6 for a week. Each evening, we would get together on either Ariadne or Danaï, with Dan and Ruby alternating the cooking. Terry and I concentrated on helping the French to reduce the size of their wine lake. After 4 days, we were more than ready to move on, if only to get some cooler air out to sea. Although they had already been there, Terry and Ruby suggested that we all go over to Saint-Denis-d'Oléron. It was only a 15-mile passage, but Terry was keen that I take some photographs of his Jenica on the way, and he would take a few photographs of Ariadne. Mojito did not join us and went exploring elsewhere. Terry had arranged the Jenica so that it could be permanently carried on a stumpy bowsprit with a roller drum that enabled the sail to be set and furled from the cockpit. On the whole, it worked fairly well, although there were occasional difficulties in getting the shoulders at the top of the sail to roll in properly. Saint-Denis has a small harbour with a natural sill so that one always stays afloat. On a previous visit during spring tides, the water outside the harbour had almost disappeared, but we remained properly afloat. On this occasion the tides were neap and the range was very small. We had managed to get the boats into adjacent berths, so the stay at Saint-Denis was very sociable, but we still had our privacy and independence. We quickly set up the beach umbrella that Terry had loaned to us to keep the withering sun off the cockpit table, which we loaded with a bottle of muscadet and a couple of bowls of crevette. The next morning we strolled gently up to the town and wandered round the market with its wonderful displays of all manner of fish, meat, fruit, vegetables, as well as clothes and jewellery and all the other paraphernalia associated with the French market. Altogether, we spent 3 nights in Saint-Denis. The heat was wilting, but it is a pleasant place to be. Indeed, unless there is a strong reason for going to La Rochelle, Saint-Denis has a much more pleasant atmosphere than the marina at Les Minimes. We were picking up tips from Terry and Ruby on preparing oysters. What you need is an oyster knife with a sharp point but without sharp blades and a roll of elastoplast. Terry did not like the oyster knife that I had bought in the market because one side of the blade was sharpened and he reckoned that I was asking for trouble. We also learned a few tricks from him and Ruby about preparing moules. Saint-Denis had made us welcome. The facilities are adequate and clean. Even the capitanery was decorated with hanging baskets. We had enjoyed our stay, but the time had come to move on. Terry and Ruby had left the Solent a month before us and now wanted to start a leisurely journey northwards. We, on the other hand, still wanted to visit Rochefort and St. Martin-de-Ré. As we would have to motor for 15 miles up the Charente River in any case, the lack of wind did not matter much, but we knew it would be extremely hot inland in Rochefort. Nevertheless, we decided to press on and visit what we had been told was a fascinating town. Just after lunch, we made our farewells with Terry and Ruby, who had decided to remain for an extra day in Saint-Denis, and set off across the Baie d'Oléron. The only excitement was caused by the wash from the passing vedettes, of which there were a great number. It was another hot and windless day as we motored past Fort Boyard. Then, rounding to the south of Ile d'Aix, we headed towards Fouras looking for the first long-range leading marks into the Charente estuary. So far, we had been visiting relatively easy harbours, and although I had occasionally checked Malcolm Robson's books for confirming transits, it had only been an extra check, although they had proved useful when going into Saint-Gilles when the water depths proved to be less than expected. Now, however, we would need to maintain a long transit to enter the Charente River. The first transit was so far inland that at first I could only find it in the compass binoculars. It was certainly impossible to photograph it. Once located, however, it made steering in the strong cross-currents very easy. Then we turned on to the next line. The leading marks are in a jumble of buildings. The photograph was taken when we were quite close in, but at first, even with the binoculars, Robson's drawings helped enormously to identify the shapes of the leading marks, far better than any photograph could possibly be. This is a river that makes its way inland in long, graceful, sweeping curves. In places there were buildings of obvious historic interest by the waterside. Also, numerous fishing lodges from which the locals obviously collect large numbers of crevette and, no doubt, other seafood. Eventually we came to the bridges. Fortunately, the swing bridge referred to in Malcolm Robson's books, which only opened twice a day in the early morning and late evening, has been replaced by an elegant high-level fixed bridge. The old transporter bridge is still there and is still operated at weekends as a museum piece. We reached the entrance to Rochefort at the correct time and had to motor about in the river waiting for the boats to leave and dodging the occasional commercial ship. Anywhere else, such ships would appear to be the small coasters that they actually are. Here they fill the river. Eventually we were able to go through the gates into the old port of Rochefort. We were allocated a berth in the far basin and made ourselves as comfortable as we could in the heat. Already it looked quite a fascinating spot. Surprisingly, this attractive dish, maigre de canard, is quite quick to prepare, and the last thing Dan wanted was to spend a long time cooking on a hot evening. In the morning we set off along the riverbank, seeking the dry dock in which Hermione, the full-sized reconstruction of an 18th century frigate, was being built. Rochefort was built specifically as an armoury, a marine armoury, a long way up a river so that it would be safe from British attack, although there was one major raid mounted in longboats and launches. Within the town, all the main services for a shipyard existed, including barracks and stores, a foundry, timber stores, sail-making and rigging lofts, nail workshops, and a magnificent ropeworks. The ropeworks building is nearly a quarter of a mile long. Many of the buildings have been converted into museums, and once you have paid marina fees, you get discounted entry fees once your tide table booklet has been stamped. Hermione sits in a dry dock, itself an interesting piece of history that was almost rediscovered by accident. Started some years ago, she is being built in oak. Traditional methods are being used throughout, including full-sized lofting of the frames and bulkheads, as was the case when I started shipbuilding in the 1960s. The timetable has slipped, but the project is designed to provide tourist interest, so that is not particularly important. The current expectation of float-out and commencement of rigging is 2010. After a long look at the hull, it is fascinating to go through the other workshops where they are building associated structures such as fighting tops and longboats, and even the ship's wheel. There is also an extensive forge making belaying pins, forged bolts and any other required metalwork. There are some finished boats on show, as well as some wonderful models. We thought we had earned lunch at a street restaurant. Dan had walked about a mile, which was no mean achievement. Fortunately, we managed to find a bus that dropped us off near the marina. Originally, we had planned to stay overnight and leave on the morning lockout, but it was so hot among the enclosed buildings that we opted to leave straight away on the evening tide. This meant we would not get the opportunity to look closely at the ropeworks, but that can wait for another year. The trip down the river was uneventful, apart from encountering two coasters passing just below the bridges. We picked up a mooring off the Club Nautique about halfway to the estuary. It was a lot cooler there than in the town. This year, Bastille Day, 15th of July, fell on a weekend. It was now the 12th of July, and we decided that we should get to St Martin de Ré as quickly as possible to try and get a berth. It would undoubtedly be a scrum, but we were ready to have a few days of harbour rot, and there is no better place than St Martin. We were also aware that another Marchwood boat, Passenger, was in the area, and we thought that they might be anchored off the south end of Ile de Ré. There was quite a brisk breeze that morning, With the high pressure still sitting out in the Atlantic, it was from the north, which would give us a beat towards the Ray Bridge. To make sure of the best tide, we left quite early, under engine, until we were well clear of the estuary and standing out towards Ile d'Aix. To starboard, we could see the rather bleak-looking Fort Denay. It was indeed a very pleasant beat up towards the south end of the Ile de Ré, which we reached by late morning. Passenger was there, and we anchored nearby. Mike and Janet came over by dinghy, and we had a pleasant lunch together, sheltering as best we could from the sun. It was interesting comparing notes with them. They had left the Solent long before us, but had become involved in a folk festival at Benedey, where they had had a most interesting and enjoyable time. They had already been in St. Martin, so we left them at anchor shortly after lunch and joined the fleet waiting for the gates of St. Martin to open. Eventually we slotted into the queue and worked our way through the tortuous entrance to the lock. We were directed by Monsieur Garnier, the harbour master, to berth on one of the visitors' berths, 4 out. Garnier is quite a character and always stands on the lock wall directing the incoming yachts like an orchestral conductor. With his shock of grey hair he looks not unlike Simon Rattle, although I have never seen the latter conducting an orchestra wearing shorts. This is a fascinating little harbour, with an island in the middle. One side of the island dries, but the other side is gated to form a wet harbour. From the pierhead, one scans through the entrance channel, round past the lock, and into the main pool, which can get very crowded in summer. Although the mooring arrangements are totally chaotic, we like St. Martin de Ré, and Dan was even prepared to cope with clambering over 4 boats to get to the pontoon. There are numerous pavement cafes and above all a wonderful market with the best selection of bread, fish, meat and vegetables that you could wish for. It's open every day, including Sunday. With all the boats being tucked together, one quickly makes friends with the adjacent boats, unless the boat outside happens to be a large French charter boat, in which case one has to suffer Napoleon's army advancing to the shore during the day and retreating back to the boat late at night. We were not that surprised to find that Passenger came into the harbour the next morning, having had a rather uncomfortable night in a fresh breeze in the rather exposed anchorage at the south of the Ile de Ré. On Bastille Day itself, Mike and Janet from Passenger joined us for an evening meal which stretched until the light faded, and we sat in the cockpit and watched the fireworks, which as usual were an impressive display. Janet thought it was very nice of them to set off fireworks on her birthday. The harbour was absolutely packed over the weekend, and this panorama photograph which I took was after 3 boats had already left the harbour. It seemed almost impossible that you could get another boat in. On the following day we had quite a lot of excitement. Dan and I were about to go ashore when Monsieur Garnier, the assistant harbour master, came rushing around. They had closed the gate an hour earlier, and it had only just become apparent that there must be something jammed in the seal. It seemed water was pouring out of the harbour, and the harbour master was worried that all the boats would drown. We were all asked to set lines from the masthead to the quay in an attempt to hold the boats upright if the water dropped too far. In the event, we did dry, but by less than a foot. 1 or 2 boats in the harbour were at rather crazy angles, but the masthead lines had been sufficient to save the day. When the tide returned and the gates could be opened, divers discovered that a small rock had got into the sill. Having had several days of rest and soaked up the atmosphere of this wonderful marine village, we were ready to commence our northward journey by the 17th of July. We had thoroughly enjoyed exploring Charente-Maritime. Our broad plan was to be past Ushant by the end of the third week in August, that is, before the unsettled September weather set in. Our cruise was far from over, and there would be many interesting encounters with rustlers and other yachts on the way home.